Yep. Mhm. So understanding those plants and how they grow in your garden, and particularly what type of plant that you have, is key to understanding how to manage your landscape. My background has been, just to give a little bit of my background, back in the 80s, I was working for a landscape company in the Baltimore area, was co-owner with a bunch of other young people, and we did mostly landscapes, privately owned, and as well as commercial properties all over Baltimore City and Baltimore County. And I pretty much learned on the fly how to do things. I had some good teachers. I stumbled on the Master Gardener program and wanted to learn how to learn even more, and also how to help other people by transferring my knowledge and the knowledge that the Master Gardener program imparts in you. And so I did that for a while, and then worked for a nonprofit called Parks and People, running their community forestry program, became arborist, and then started working for an engineering firm, and then went back to the nonprofit world, and started with a bunch of other women, the Baltimore Tree Trust. After a while, left that and started another firm, another nonprofit called the Flowering Tree Trails of Baltimore, and planted trees in our parks along the trails, which was a lot of fun. So now I'm retired, but my whole life is just volunteering for different organizations, including Master Gardeners, as always, and also on the board of the Friends of Herring Run Parks. So just giving back after all that I've learned and all the different people that I've met has been wonderful. And I really enjoy working outside and learning by doing. So I'm always learning, still learning, especially the computer, and just got a Mac this year. So learning how to do things that way. So my PowerPoint has now loaded into this email. Ashley, it's swirling through the ionosphere towards you, hopefully, and then we can pop it up on the screen. And like I say, it's only about 17 slides to kick things off our discussion about pruning shrubs. I don't know if anybody has taken the Tree Keepers program, and through that program we have also learned about pruning trees. So some of this information can be applied to trees as well as shrubs. Lots of shrubs that do well here in Maryland and in Baltimore in our zones. Many flowering shrubs and evergreens do very well here. So we have a wealth of species and varieties to choose from for our landscapes, which is great. I don't know if you've noticed, but we've had a bit of an early spring, and some shrubs that would bloom later in the spring have already started blooming. I know in my yard, my Spirea Van Houte is just going crazy, and that doesn't usually bloom until May, and here it is blooming now. So maybe there's some other shrubs that you have in your yard that you've noticed have started blooming early. And we can talk about that when I get through the PowerPoint. But just want to emphasize, don't be afraid. That don't be afraid to prune. You can see here on the right-hand side that this particular shrub, this is on a median on North Avenue, has a lot of cuts. You can see the white marks on the stems. So here's an example of a shrub or tree, probably at one time it was a tree, but has multiple stems that really needed to be uncovered to find its shape, which is a vase shape. And so all those lower suckers were removed. Some of the branches a little bit above the suckers were removed to open up that shrub, and some of the stems removed in order to reduce the amount of food and nutrients going to all that growth, and then make that structure more robust. And I think probably it helps in this case on a median with sight lines for drivers as they're going down the North Avenue, very busy, high traffic zone. So there is a shrub in there somewhere, and you'll see that when you start to look at your shrub in a different way as far as learning how to prune it properly. So we can go to the next slide. So if we step back a minute and talk about shrubs in our garden, we know as master gardeners, two main broad areas of shrubbery: evergreens and deciduous. Evergreens then can be broken down into broadleaf and needle. Broadleaf evergreens, things like rhododendrons, euonymus, azalea, pyracantha, nandina, boxwood, etc. And they have latent buds. Needle evergreens, such as your pine, your spruce, things like juniper and yew, they don't have latent buds. And then deciduous shrubs like forsythia, spirea, as I've mentioned, weigela, all those beautiful spring flowering shrubs that we see now, like gangbusters, have latent bugs. Now, what buds? What do I mean by that? Well, that means that when you prune them, you can stimulate those buds which are latent or just sort of sleeping, if I may use that term, and then you'll bust out more growth. Where needle evergreens do not have that specialized cells that latent buds have, so that when you do a drastic pruning on a needle evergreen, it's not really going to bounce back well. Junipers don't take to heavy pruning. They're very woody, and so they're not really going to stimulate any new growth below that cut. So you have to be very careful in understanding the type of shrubs you have in your yard in this very broad sense of evergreen versus deciduous and broadleaf versus needle is one of the first steps. Next slide. So next, we're just going to run through pruning objectives. Why are we doing this? Well, to maintain health, like we showed in the very first slide about that plant that needed to get more air circulation, less heavy wood in there in order to distribute the nutrients and the water better to the other parts of the tree, to develop a stronger structure. Perhaps it's to control size. You bought something from the nursery that was adorable and small, and you put it right up against your house or a window, and lo and behold, it's maxed out its size and it's much larger than you had realized. Also, pruning objectives could be for a better fruit and flower production, and then of course for aesthetics. And we'll just run through those. Next slide. But first I want to talk about this on the next slide, this maintaining of the health of shrubs. And this can also be applied to trees. And we teach tree keepers this 5 Ds. And this is you can remove the dead branching, the dying branching. It's something that may have been damaged, something that's obviously diseased, or something that's defective at any time of the year. So these problems that you may encounter in your shrub or tree can be pruned out any time of the year without regard to the timing of the flower or the new growth. So the 5 Ds: dead branches, dying branches, disease, damaged, or defective branching. And water sprouts, sucker growth, those kinds of growths can be pruned out at any time of year. Next slide. So pruning methods that we are learning about are tipping, which is when you you cut off the terminal ends, that is the very tip ends of your shrub, and that's going to promote bushiness in your shrub. And it's a good thing to do at late winter to remove any dead pieces off of your shrub. Thinning then is done to promote strong growth and maybe to open that shrub up so that you can have bigger and better flowering by removing some of this extraneous growth, create more light availability into the shrub, removing the old canes of the shrub that are not productive as much anymore. And you do this in the early spring. Shearing, a lot of landscape companies do this, get the guys with the machine in their hand, their power equipment, go through and shear shrubs. And people who like to shape shrubs into balls or maybe other shapes will shear over and over and over again, year after year, taking off maybe 1 to 2 inches of growth. And this is done really to control growth and control size, and it creates a thicker foliage in some plants. Rejuvenation, which is what you can do in order to bring back a shrub that maybe has gotten very leggy or straggly in appearance, and you just want to start over again with that plant and cut it way back. So pruning methods to rejuvenate a shrub is another goal, another thing to do. Now, espalier and topiary are two things you do for the aesthetics. So espalier is pruning a shrub to be profiled against a wall or a fence. And that's a very specific type of pruning, as well as topiary to create those whimsical shapes and animal shapes, or different types of shapes for your garden for the ornamental value. And you would probably be doing that several times throughout the season, pruning, in order to keep those plants within those ornamental shapes that you want. So these are different pruning methods. Next slide. To reinforce this types of pruning, there's pinching, deadheading, heading, and rejuvenating. And some of this is repetition, but it's showing you with these images what we're talking about. So with something like a pine, you can just, to regulate the growth, you can pinch off that candle. You can pinch it off halfway, or you can pinch it off all the way to the bud there in order to control the growth. If you do not want that to grow out any larger for the space that you have for that plant, with evergreens like needle evergreens like a pine or a mugo pine, something small, you can pinch off that new soft growth, that candle, in order to control growth. There's also deadheading. This is can be very meticulous and tedious. So this picture shows deadheading the old flowers off of a lilac. And that can be done with rhododendrons, where you pinch off that growth, careful not to pinch off the two new leaves that are emerging right below that old flower head. But and that's done to direct the new growth to taking care of, to direct the energy of the plant to taking care of new growth, and not putting it into developing seed heads on the bloom. So you want a deadhead in order to increase your blooms for next year and to increase the strength of new growth. So deadheading is another type of pruning. Can be tedious depending on the size of your plant. Heading back is a way to restrict growth, to change growth. And as you can see in the picture in the lower left, they're cutting to the next lateral. So they're pruning a piece of that plant to reduce its size, but they're not leaving a stub. They're pruning it back to those next two pieces of growth that are hardy and alive, and that will then increase their strength and promote growth and possibly pop latent buds on the ends of those twigs. And then rejuvenating in the lower left-hand corner, person has a small handsaw taking out older canes that are no longer productive and opening up the inside of that plant to allow for better air circulation and better light, to get those older canes that may be rotting or diseased, even, to get them out of there. So that you do about a third of that, take out about a third every year, is a good way to rejuvenate. That can be done on plants. Next slide. So here's a neat illustration I swapped off the internet about that illustrates these points of tipping off. So they're showing the tipping off of some of those that growth there that's sticking way up. If you want to reduce the size of your plant, or to redirect the energies of the plant to the existing canes, deadheading, taking off the old flower growths, and then removing some of those stems. The shadows are the things that were taken out to open up that shrub and to then reduce that size, so that the energy which is stored in the roots, of course, is going towards those healthy stems. That could be new stems or maybe 1 or 2 year old stems that will make your plant much healthier. Next slide. Another illustration in the next slide is of thinning your plant. So here we have on the left-hand side at 9 canes on this plant, and reducing it by third, leaving 5. So almost by third, leaving a little bit more, taking out about 5 canes then to open that shrub up. And you're looking at your plant and saying, what are the healthy canes? What are the vigorous growth? That's what you want to promote and leave, and thin out those canes that are kind of had their day. Let's put it that way. Next slide. So we talk about proper cuts to make on trees and shrubs, and we can test ourselves by looking at these cuts here, these 4 different examples, and seeing what is wrong, which one is the ideal cut. So if we hit the arrow again, that will reveal that if you advance the slide again, you'll see that that is too long. So you're leaving too much of a stem there, too much growth before those lateral buds. And that stem then would be just rotting away, and maybe a portal for diseases or pests to get into the plant. The second one, as you can see, is just too close to that little bud on the right, not giving it enough cells of the stem to really prosper. And the third one there is too slanted. Too slanted means that it's actually a larger cut, the circumference and the shape then gives it a larger cut, and then that's more energy having to put into that to what we call callus over or heal. It's not really healing, but to blocking off that portal to disease and pests growth. So of course, that leaves the last one, which is your ideal, where you're leaving maybe a 1/4 of an inch of the stem to the next growth. And that always is cut to viable growth and not to a dead piece. You don't cut to a dead, you find where there's a nice piece of growth that's about to break, and you want to cut to that. And ideally, you would want to cut to direct that growth. So if we look at this last cut, we see that means that the leaf bud on the right is going to shoot out to the right. And if that's where you want to direct your growth, that's the one you cut to. If you wanted to direct your growth to the left, then you might want to cut down to that little bud on the left. And I'm sure that your work with roses, very obvious, this is how it works. Rose buds and rosebud pruning to direct growth out is very common. Next slide. So we also want to talk about time to prune. When do we prune? Good time to prune, of course, is in the winter. You're covered up, especially for those sticky plants that you might have, those thorny plants like hawthorn or other types of thorny plants like pyracantha, firethorn and such, where you're covered up. That's one aspect. But people are afraid to prune, and they're afraid that they don't understand when things flower because they haven't really been paying attention. So you have to think about in terms of how healthy your plant is. When does it flower? Are you having problems with mildew, such as mildew on lilacs? Maybe you need to prune in order to open that up. Think about your plant in terms of what is its natural shape and where is that now? And can we prune back to restore it to its natural shape? So let's move to the next slide where we talk more about timing and pruning. These two concepts you'll find a lot in talking about pruning shrubs: new wood versus old wood. So new wood is wood that grows throughout the growing season on plants like butterfly bushes, rose of Sharon. So the spring growth will produce branches that hold those summer blooms. So you want to prune those in the late winter or the very early spring before any new growth arise. So new wood, summer blooming shrubs then can take a hard cut in the wintertime, in the late winter. And they're all that hard cut will do, all that hard pruning or drastic pruning will really spur new growth, which will then spur all those summer blooms. And that is to be contrasted with old wood. So our spring flowering plants, which are so beautiful this time of year, produce flowers on 1-year-old wood. So wood that they've been producing the whole year before they bloom. So old wood, you want to wait until they finish flowering, right? So you want to wait until the forsythia is finished before you prune it. You want to wait till that quince, which is all done now, wait till that quince is finished pruning to prune those shrubs. Because if you prune them in the early winter in order to shape or to renovate or rejuvenate, you're going to lose those flowers, right? You can always, as I said, you can always prune dead stuff, sucker growth, things that are crossing. But in the wintertime, you want to leave these old wood shrubs, the ones that are going to bloom in the spring, like your lilacs, your abelias, most of your hydrangeas, just leave them to go through that season. And then when they're finished blooming, then you can prune them if you need to, if you need to prune. Okay, next slide. I hope those concepts are clear. Now, this is just a guideline that I've learned over the years doing landscaping about timing. And I must say that things are changing, right, with climate change. And so there are shifts in this calendar. But as I said before, things that are blooming now, we want to wait until after June to start pruning those things, unless with evergreen candles, you want to just snap those candles in half or pinch them out completely. And then after the summer, when the summer comes through, you can prune your flowering shrubs when they're finished blooming, and some evergreens and some fruit trees can be pruned if they're vigorously growing in the summer. And then in the winter months, in December, January, February is when you can do your structural pruning. The plants are dormant, so the roots are still growing, but they have stored all the nutrients in the roots, and the top structure is not working, no photosynthesis going on, obviously. So a good time to see the structure of the plant without the leaves for those deciduous plants. So we want to do those in the off season, so to speak. And when you're covered up for those thorny plants. And so March 15th is a good last day to prune trees and summer flowering plants because March 15th sort of has always been that period of time when things are really starting to break. The buds are starting to break, and you just want to leave those things go and let them go through their natural processes before you do your pruning. Likewise, after August 1st, there's that period in early fall, August, September, October, when plants are going into senescence, dropping their leaves if they're deciduous. So you don't want to be do heavy pruning at that time, because you don't want to promote growth that may get killed by an early frost. Now, if your plants are very hardy and vigorous, they'll do fine, but you'll just have a lot of brown new growth if you get an early frost. So we say, do your pruning in July, after July 15th to August for those kinds of shrubs and trees, and then give everything a break until the winter when they're completely dormant. Best time, I think, to finish up your pruning is early in March, when things are just before bud break. Okay, next slide. Almost finished here. So here are some examples. Hydrangeas. Now, there are a lot of shrubs that have many different varieties. As you know, with hydrangeas, lots of different varieties. So the big leaf hydrangea, the macrophylla, blooms on actually new and old wood. So that's a little tricky, and that's where you need to understand when it blooms and what to take out. Oak leaf, old wood, right? So you want to wait until after that's finished flowering. Some people like to leave those flower heads on their shrubs even throughout the winter. I've learned to hold back and do that in some cases too, maybe because I'm just lazy, but that winter interest for my asters and my oak leaf is kind of a cool thing. But it depends on the rhythm of you working out in your yard too, as to when you want to do that. So on new wood, you have your paniculata hydrangeas, your arborescens, your smooth hydrangeas. They bloom on new wood, so you want to wait till they're finished blooming in the later parts of the summer to prune those. And then the next slide covers viburnum, which is a huge grouping of shrubs of different sizes and types, native and non-native. There are even some evergreen ones, the leatherleaf, which produces a lot of pollen. So the bloom time on those could be different, but mostly we're talking about anywhere from April through June. These different viburnums are blooming, and you want to prune them when they're finished flowering, take them back, like this example here, where the shrub, I mean, it's gorgeous up against that house, but maybe there's a window back there somewhere, or a hose bib that you want to get to. So you might want to prune in order to get better access to the hose bib, or to bring the size down of that plant. Next slide. So we're just going to talk a little bit about pruning tools. The first slide on the left, showing those hand tools. We have the bypass pruners as well as the anvil type. I prefer the bypass. The anvil can be used on shrubs that have maybe hollow stems, because when they do join the anvil points, they will crush the stem a bit. So if you're picky about that kind of thing, try using the bypass pruners, which act more as a scissors. They bypass each other. The blades bypass. 1/4 to a 1/2 inch size stem is what you cut with those. And then you move into your pruning saws, and those are different lengths. The handy little saws that fold up and stick in your pocket, best. I think the number of Japanese made models are really sharp, really handy, and they work on the pull. That is, as opposed to a carpenter saw, which is back and forth, they work on the pull. So 1-inch caliper stems are good for those, and different lengths you can buy for those, wooden or plastic, and you can even buy sheaths for them if you want to get that. And then of course your loppers, your long-handled loppers, 1.5 inch size, enable you to reach up higher into a tree. Some have telescoping handles, and I even have a pair of pruners on a stick that has the mechanism to open and close the pruning bottom. And so those are different tools. Remember, don't do anything around power lines. When your kids are out running around your yard, and there may be a threat of something hitting them that you've cutting. So things like lights, cars, or other targets, your neighbor's car, you don't want to prune. Think about everything around you before you start pruning, and use personal protection equipment. If you're doing trees, you certainly want to make sure you're wearing a hard hat of some kind if you're doing some major pruning like that, and gloves is a good idea. Next slide. So just as a summary here, use those clean, sharp tools. You can clean your tools with a 70% rubbing alcohol. You want to oil them first, because rubbing alcohol can be rather corrosive. So you want to oil them after you've cleaned them. You can clean them between different types of shrubs, but I wouldn't be so crazy about cleaning them after each cut on a shrub, because if the shrub has some kind of disease that's already in the shrub, I wouldn't worry about having to clean it within that shrub, but you don't want to transfer that to another shrub. So it is a good idea to clean between shrubs. Also to observe and study the plant, understanding that the rhythm of that plant's growth and when it blooms, because you don't want to lose your blooms unless you have to, in order to reduce that size of the plant, and you can't help it. And study that plant in terms of how healthy it is, and where the sun hits it, and you know, how much woody growth is on that plant that you could relieve it of in order to find the original shape of that, natural shape of that plant. Also remember that you can remove crossing branches, suckers, and water sprouts, dead branches, diseased branches, dying branches at any time. Branches full of a fungus, such as secondary pest, you know, prune that out at any time. And when you're looking at helping your trees structurally or your plants structurally, you want to identify the oldest wood and remove about a third every year of those canes, get the older canes out of there and let that new growth take over and produce for you. And after bloom, in a general way, use that 1/3 rule of cutting back 1/3 of the growth if you need to. So we don't use pruning paint anymore. I know we don't typically have never used that on shrubs, but I do get that question a lot. Plants have a natural way of closing off the cells. So we don't want to put paint on that to interrupt that natural process. Never leave a stub and clean your boots before you come in the house. Thank you. And so that's my little presentation. Sorry, we were so late getting started. And I certainly will take any questions or have discussions about specific shrubs, and maybe you all have some other ideas that you want to open up about talking about pruning shrubs. So we can go in the chat, I guess, and put questions in, or else we'd have a free-for-all of everybody talking at once, and that's not ideal. So while I'm waiting for any questions on the chat, I will talk about figs because people ask a lot about figs. Figs are very popular right now, buying figs and planting figs because they produce some delicious fruit. Figs do really well in Baltimore. They like that little protected area that you may have on the side of your house out of the northeast winds, the cold winter winds. They tend to come back, and even if they do get hard hit by a winter, which of course we may not be getting anymore, right? But you want to prune figs so that you have these strong, stout branches and open that up to a lot of airflow and open up that plant to sunshine so that it can flower well, and then follow that with some good healthy fruit. So you do want to prune out any weak branches and leave a good structure of healthy main branches that are well spaced. Any questions? As our moderator could help, but I can go into the chat too, I think.
I can read them out. Someone was asking, should you prune a lemon/citrus tree, and if so, when?
Citrus trees don't really do well here in Baltimore. I don't have a lot of experience with citrus because not really familiar that they do well in the Baltimore area due to our zone. But if you're looking to prune a fruit tree, which is a citrus tree, that you would want to prune that in order to have good sturdy branches to hold that fruit. And that's kind of the general rule with pruning for fruit and even flower production, big flowers, is to have an open vase-shaped way of structure of the canopy and choose good structural branches that can hold those fruit. With apple trees and peaches and all, that you want to keep those branches shorter and stout and prune out any suckers that take away from the energies going to the fruit. So citrus in particular, I don't have experience with because it is not for our zone, though it may be in the future. So that gives me pause that I should study up on citrus. I'm sorry about not knowing that. If anybody else has answers, I would certainly welcome that.
Few other questions. I'm going to give you two. Any particular variety of figs you recommend? In particular, oil to use on tools after cleaning with alcohol?
Okay, so whatever is sold in your area is going to be best for your area. So a reputable retailer is not going to be stocking inventory that's not going to do well in our area. So read the labels, read the tags on those plants in our nurseries and in our retail centers, and look at those maximum sizes, because a fig can get up to 30 foot tall. So if you want a smaller plant, make sure you look at the maximum growth size that is listed on that label. And that goes with any plants, is look at those attributes that they list on the label, or talk to the person who's running the nursery. They should know their stock. And what was the other part of that question?
What oil do you recommend using on your
Oh,
tools?
oil. You can use 2% oil that you would put in your blower, or if you're using gas power, if you're still using gas powered equipment, or machine oil. And you're just rubbing it on on the blade then, after you use your alcohol to clean off anything that may have been picked up by those blades.
Next question, is it too late to prune a dwarf persimmon tree?
Too late. Well, it depends on the health of the tree, right? And its access to sun, whether it's really growing well. It's not, I don't think it's too late. They bloom a little later, they fruit later. I don't think so, but be judicious about it.
How often do you sharpen your cutting tools?
I sharpen my cutting tools before a season of pruning. So before I go out in the winter, and I don't usually prune trees until February, I wait for the harshness of the winter season, which we haven't had a couple of years, to do its damage before I go out and prune trees. I wait really closer to bud break, February and March. And so I'll clean everything before that. You can clean it at any time before you put things away in the fall. My father used to do that. He used to actually put linseed oil on the handles of his wooden handles of his tools to protect them and to have them live long, have a longer lifespan. Yeah, so before you go out and prune, if you've done a bunch of pruning, then you want to cut that blade, sharpen that blade after that. And there's a way to check that, and I have a pair of scissors here I can show you to see how sharp that is. And you can take the blade of your pruning saws and run it down your thumbnail, and you can feel how sharp that is that way. If it's resisting as you're dragging it down your thumbnail, you know that it's really sharp, okay? So what you're doing is just sharpening on an angle your pruners to create this really sharp, thin line here. And then you're going to take the other side of it and take that pruning stone and rub it gently on the other side to get rid of the burr that occurs when you do this. And you always want to put it at the same angle as that pruning blade is, the same angle you're rubbing that stone across that way. Make sure your stone is wet also. At Silburn every year in the winter, they have this wonderful woman come from a landscape design firm, and she teaches you about pruning your tools. It's great. I've been to it. I highly recommend it as an off-season activity for master gardeners. And you can even buy a whetstone from her and some of the oil that she recommends. So look that up next year.
Okay, we have several questions. People are finally typing and coming in. I have a black haw viburnum that is large, more tree form, and seems to be very healthy, but seems to sucker a lot. 2 questions. Is a lot of suckering normal? And are the shoots I see coming up to 6 feet away suckers or possibly seedlings? Also, I guess we're up to 3 questions. What is the best way to prune suckers?
Well, prune suckers come out from the base of the plant. Water sprouts are up here along the stems or the branches of the plant. So the best way to prune suckers is cut them right to the ground or right to the trunk, the base of the trunk, cut them off. Some plants tend to sucker more. So you may have to do that throughout the growing season. We know cherry trees do that a lot, and certain other plants sucker a lot. The growth that you may see 6 foot out from your viburnum is probably a shoot coming off of the root. So plants propagate that way particularly plants that are colonizing kind of plants, like pawpaws do the same thing, create this colony, because it's fun to be in with a lot more of your kind, right? Of your species. So, you colonize, you send out growth away from your the parent growth that way. Other thing like layering, rhododendrons will layer. Those lower branches then hitting the ground will root out where that part of the branch hits the ground. You can actually transplant a piece that way to a different part of your garden. When you say that the viburnum is suffering, I don't know what that means.
Well,
So I can't really.
So what you just described, that's what I thought, the ones that are further away from the tree that are coming off the roots. So they're not called suckers then.
No, it's propagating itself. Yeah, it's propagating
Okay.
itself.
So prune those back to ground level if you don't want to thicket.
If you don't want to thicket, then you would take your spade, your sharp spade, and just do a root prune. Right?
That's what I've been doing, but I just was curious because it's super healthy. I don't think it's not doing that because it's unhealthy, correct? I mean, it just seems to be a lot more than I've expected it to sucker. And again, I'm using the term sucker, but it's not actually a sucker. So, okay. Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah, but you're right, though, in saying that when plants sucker at the base, it's kind of a sign of it not doing well, because it's trying to get a lot of growth out quickly in order to photosynthesize and get those sugars to then help itself. But that sucker growth is not strong growth, right? So it's not very supportive of the health of the plant to have a lot of sucker growth, and it will never replicate that main stem of the plant.
Okay. Thank you.
Next question. I have 2 sweet bay magnolias, which are about 3 years old. They are smallish, yet have been growing well. Is there a general time frame to wait before first prune?
So sweet bay are very slow growing, I found. A beautiful shrub, native shrub to our area. I don't think they need a lot of pruning. Multi-stem shrub. You can prune to a single stem if you want, if that's what you want. But I don't see that they require very much pruning unless there's some specific reason to prune. I would let it go. Remember, pruning creates wounds in a plant. So if you don't have to prune something, why create all these wounds that the energy of the plant has to go to dealing with that wound?
You got to thank you. I'd like to learn more about pruning native shrubs, but have not been able to find any videos on YouTube. Are there any recommendations for recorded webinars or websites with this information? It seems like it's a little species specific, and I want to get it correct.
So I put this presentation together by going to the internet and having, of course, some experience on this, but I never saw anything specific to native shrubbery. You're right. So I would just, instead of looking for that search engine title, I would think about the native shrubs that you have and when they bloom, and use that same guide to how to prune them. And there's plenty of stuff on the internet, particularly with your extension services all over the country. North Carolina, Missouri, these extension agents in Virginia, Kentucky, they have very good information on trees and shrubs, and people like you and me have put these things together, as well as agents that are paid to do it. It's very helpful. And there's a lot of gardeners out there who've put together their own YouTube videos on pruning, and that's a mixed bag. Some of them are hilarious, but people are very earnest, and I find them very amusing. So, but I would recommend that instead of looking just for native in a search engine for that, just you find out whether you have new wood or old wood or the type of plants that you have, and put that in, as opposed to just looking for a native. pruning shrubs. That's all you got to put in. And then you'll come up with lots of opportunities. I hope that was helpful.
That is all of the questions from the chat. Oh, I might have lied. Nope, it was not. It was a reference to your or someone asking about references. Sandra says for pruning trees itself, Ted Martello, who works for the city, recommends Ed Gilman videos. So
I recommend Ed Gilman. Also, he has a marvelous book on pruning, and he is well known as a good expert on pruning trees, particularly the concept of pruning for better structural growth, and what we call subordinating or pruning over period of time, so that you don't prune everything all at once. You do a little bit this year, do another section that next year, so that there's this balance between the root growth and the top growth. So they're not taking away too much of that food factory, which is pulling in the sun, creating those sugars, providing nutrients to the plant and then also to the roots. So that understanding how to balance that out, Ed Gilman is a good resource for that. I agree.
We did have another question sneak in. What are the main difference between pruning trees versus pruning shrubs?
I guess height, right? And of course, the tools that you would use. So with trees, you're going to use saws more than hand pruners, possibly, and pole pruners. And trees are single stem largely. And so you're pruning to keep developing that single stem, because trees will have a tendency to, a lot of trees, to produce codominant stems. So the trunk gets to a certain point, and then there's two pieces to that, two strong branches that are developing at the same speed and the same size. And that means they're producing the same, they're sucking the same amount of energy from those roots to produce mirror images of themselves, which means that at some point they're going to have problems. Either they're going to break off, like we've seen calorie pears, or they're going to merge together with that codominant stem. So with tree pruning, you're trying to prune to a single stem largely. I'm not talking about fruit trees now. I'm talking about deciduous shade trees. And prune that tree in order to develop that good branch structure for the future. Flowering shrubs, you're going to be doing that through its whole lifetime, probably more often pruning than you would trees. I tend to prune trees every third year. I'll go in and do some pruning on a tree. Not every year, unless it's sucker growth or water sprouts or a broken branch or something that's diseased. So the differences have to do with the tools that you use, has to do with the type of growth that you have, and it has to do with the amount of growth and the direction of growth. So yeah, there's kind of a big difference there.
And the season of the year, and the season of the year.
And the season of the year, yes. So we teach to prune trees in the off season when you can see that growth. Though the second best time to prune trees is if the trees are growing well in the summer, so July, when they've finished putting out all those new leaves, then and they're taking a break, then you can do some pruning if you need to. That would be the second best time. Trees put on girth in this primarily in that second ring they're putting on in the summertime. Well, I hope this has been helpful for y'all, and I certainly would take any other questions offline. My email is ahc819@gmail.com. If you have any further questions that you're too shy to ask or that you think about later. I'm not a super duper expert here, but I've learned a lot on the fly, and I am a certified arborist, so I have studied it to a certain extent and learned a lot through practice. And that's really what I want to impart to you is you can start gently, but just keep doing it and you'll learn over time by doing. And don't be afraid. If your shrub is doing well and is very healthy, you're not going to kill it by cutting a few branches off of it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. I'm sorry for the slow start.